All right, we are on our final week of adult education before we take a break for the summer. And so the capstone of our time together, our adult education program, is the men's book group. We are so grateful that you are here and willing to share the fellowship and books that you've read over the years. I've already learned that John Klaus started the book group in 1999, so I'm sure we'll hear more about the history of it and have some good dialogue and conversations surrounding the life of the mind and reading together. Let's start our time together with prayer. Good and gracious God, on this brand new day, we come before you open and eager for a word from you, open and eager to engage with one another and with you, open and eager for fellowship and for your spirit to animate our spirits. I pray, Lord, that as we gather and talk and discuss and learn, that you would be our teacher and our guide. We thank you for those shoulders that we stand on, those who come before us in this venue in adult education. And we remember them this morning as we think back on the years of this book group having gathered in this space. Be with us now, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. Amen.
Morning, everybody. I'm Ed Tennent and delighted to be here with this illustrious panel here, Bob Stow and Bob Plumb. And we are three of the members of the 10 or 12 members of the men's book group, and we've got a good fun group. We've grown in our appreciation of each other and our differing views and so forth. We actually lost two members, passed away last year. Bob Wasick, who was a good close personal friend of the Klauses, and he was a member of the Gaithersburg Presbyterian Church, and even though he was not a member here, he was a faithful member of our book group and brought a lot of insight to the books that we read. And also Jack Christian passed away this year, and so it's sad that we have lost two of our good and faithful members. It's mostly a group of retired men, as you could guess by the name of the men's book group, and they are retired, or we are retired, but not everybody. And the reason that most of everybody that's a member is retired is that we meet from 10:30 to 12 noon on the third Tuesday of each month. And it's because of that time, a lot of working people are unable to make it to the meeting, but we do have a couple of people who, don't mind taking an hour and a half off once a month, to slip out, whether they are their own boss or whether they work for someone else, that they are able to sneak away for an hour and a half. So that's when we meet. It's a very democratic group. Everybody wants to know how we select books, and it's a democratic vote, and we all discuss whether or not we think we would like a particular book, and then suggest that and pick that as a read for a future date. The only requirement is that we try not to focus on politics. And in fact, it's not that we don't try not to, we will not pick a blatantly political book. So that's the only rule of what it is we read. You'll see, as well as in talking with the two Bobs here, get some feel for some of the books that we've read. One good thing about the pandemic, there's an awful lot of sadness and bad things with the pandemic, but because of the pandemic, we have discovered Zoom. And in the past, you had to be physically in the library, or we typically would meet in the parlor. If you wanted to discuss the book, you had to be here. And so for those of us, I'm down in North Carolina with my kids and grandkids frequently. And so now I can participate even when I'm out of town. So we run a hybrid organization where we have some people physically present in the church and some people participating via Zoom. I have a stack of books at home that we've read, but then again, we've got people like John Norval who doesn't have any books at all because he reads all of his on Kindle. And then we've got other people, Bob Mecklenburg, who has probably never read a book. He listens to all of his. He uses audiobooks. And for those of you that don't know Bob Mecklenburg, he is a master gardener. And he is constantly out in the yard puttering around, whatever he does, with earbuds in listening to. So probably John Klaus and Bob Mecklenburg are the two most prolific readers, and they bring us new ideas more than anybody else. So it doesn't matter what your medium that you prefer to use to acquire about a book. We use them all. The good news also is that there's no initiation fee and there's no monthly dues. And in fact, there's not even an invitation that's required. All you have to do is show up. And even if you haven't read the book, come and show up. And you're welcome to audit our book club and so forth. So anyway, just wanted to warn you all that, and I'm serious about this, there will be a quiz at the end of the session here this morning. So we have a question for each of you. So we encourage your questions. Anytime if you've got a question or whatever, please raise your hand or blurt it out and whatever. So with that, let me turn it over to the rest of the panel here.
Well, I just like, before Bob, I'd like to make sure that we have no misunderstanding. He mentioned the late Bob Wasick. He mentioned Bob Mecklenburg and Bob Stow. Bob, your name doesn't have to be Bob.
And Bob Quackenball. So over half of our group is named Bob.
Did you allow any Robs?
We're open to Rob.
We're very much so, absolutely. I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, all right.
Maybe they're waiting on a formal presentation,
I don't have any PowerPoint.
PowerPoint or something, but
Yeah, just in terms of casual conversation here, and just to make a couple of points too, just to add on as I was listening to Ed, is that not only do you not have to read the book, sometimes we've had a situation, in fact, quite recently, about 1 or 2 months ago, I forget, Greg started the book, didn't finish it in time, but he participated and he wasn't too sure about the book. He only got a little way into it. But as a result of the conversation that we all had, he said, I'm gonna have to finish that book. That was really good. So it's very informal. You don't have to feel that, if you don't quite make it through in the 1 month or whatever, still come, because the conversation is quite illuminating and it's very good, the different views that people have on the books and so on. The other thing I want to mention, and I wanted to mention something specific and share with you, at least from my perspective, a few of the books that I really enjoyed. It's only a subset of the ones, because I've enjoyed the vast number, I would say 70 or 80% of the books that we've read, I very much enjoyed. I got into the book club when I retired in 2008. And the reason I got into the book club at that point, two things. One is I was retired. So
a good qualification.
So I could make the meetings, because if I got it was just for the travel and everything else was impossible. But the other point is, one of the things, there were 3 things that I established for myself on retirement. A plan, if you will, as opposed to just say, okay, I'm retired, I'll just kind of sit around and do whatever. I said, there's 3 things I need to do. 1 is stay physically active. 2 is stay very socially engaged. And 3 was to stay intellectually stimulated. So one of my plans on intellectual stimulation was to join the book club, because it does that. And I figured if I do those 3 things, health-wise and otherwise, and mentally speaking, I'll be in good shape through the rest of my life. So that's what attracted me. The other group that I joined was the Wednesday morning Bible study, which I've been consistently since 2008 involved in. I didn't realize when I first joined that Bible study, that it was all women. I was the first man who joined the study. Now, since then, others have come into play. So anyway, couple of two anecdotal things, but specifically how I got involved in the book club. One of the things that we've done, and you've got this list of books, some folks that I've talked to in the past have suggested, well, yeah, that book sounds good, but don't you read a lot of stuff about war and history, stuff like that? And one of the things I've done, no, the answer is no. We do read some of those books, but the diversity of the books we read, I think you would be quite amazed at, if you just use a word.
Guys,
Because-
can someone send the book list, please?
Yeah, you know, Gene.
Since you're referring to it.
Yeah.
She left.
Okay.
Do we have it?
Well, she sent it to us and then, okay, well, we will try to do that, Del. We'll certainly get it to
Thank you.
before the end of the meeting. But one of the things I did that was, I was put on to by Gene, because like Ed, I have a stack of books at home. I generally buy the books on Amazon and then I keep them. So I got all of these books. One of the things Jeannie put me on to, which you all may be familiar with, is this library thing app. And what it does, and she's using it for the library in here, but I started using it at home. It's an app you can put on your phone. And what you can do, the key thing is there's no typing involved. What you do is you go around to your books and you scan a little barcode on the back of the book, and it brings up, and you can't really see this, but this is, I printed out what I have. I've scanned all the books that I've read, not all in the book club, but about 80% of them are from book club books. And then you can organize them alphabetically. It gives the author, it gives a picture of the book title. It gives a brief summary of what the book is about. All of this just comes from that barcode on the back. And then you can assign tags to it and then organize them by tags. Well, I've done that. And to give you a little bit of a feel of the breadth of what
Can I
we
just interrupt
covered.
for just a second, just
Yeah.
to get, if for those who are on Zoom and don't have a copy, it is on our website. If you go to the church website and under small groups, men's book club, the list
Oh,
that the men are referring to is there, and you can scroll down and see it.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Thanks, Emily.
Okay.
So the topic, the areas in which the books we're reading are wide are a few in what I would call adventures. One or two that what I would call in business. One or two in terms of faith. We have read some books, a handful of books over the years that have to do with faith. One of the books we read, as a matter of fact, which some of you may be familiar with, is called Zelda, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. It's quite an interesting book. It's written not from a it has the Bible as a background to it, but then it goes through the stories and tries to talk about the historical Jesus and has some differences of opinion about some of the things in the Bible, but it's very interesting. It's a book I think a number of us that went on the church trip to Israel, Sean we recommended that book.
Excuse me, just one second. I've sent a file to Dale Smith. Is there anyone else on Zoom that would like me to personally send it to you now?
Marcia and Jean.
Oh, but Bob, I'd like to know what the app is for scanning.
It's called Library Thing, Thing.
Thank you.
Okay, so history, we do have a fair amount of books. In fact, over the past, at least the ones that I have recorded the past 10 years or so, got about 48 books that have to do with history. But they fall in a variety of categories under history. American history, some on American presidents. We have 5 that we've read in that context. One on space travel, the space program, Rocket Man, I think it was. A couple on sports. In fact, Ed did not mention this, but every year we try to read at least one sports book. And one of those books, by the way, was The Boys in the Boat, which some of you may have read. A wonderful book. So anyway, that was one of my favorites, as a matter of fact. One book on aviation, the Wright Brothers, a little bit about that. 3 Civil War books. Now, if you were to talk to us, you'd think all we were doing was Civil War, but we've read under history 3 Civil War books, and a couple of those, and maybe a few more than that, although I probably have them under different categories. A couple of those written by Bob. So we've got two authors, three, actually, well, three if you go back in history, right? But Bob and Neil Curry have both written books, and we've also,
And John Hawley, who
John Hawley.
was a member of our church for many, many years that some of you all may remember, has written at least two books, and we have read those and had him come and participate via Zoom as the author leading the discussion, so.
Yeah, I might add, as recently as this year, in January, John presented his book Guardians of the Manitou Passage, which is in Michigan.
in the Great, yeah,
In the Great Lakes, a fascinating book.
yeah. And he attended and, well, defended is the wrong word. He presented. We all had a discussion about it. We read one book under history, the category of history, I would say, one book in Vietnam. That was a book of We Were Young Once and Soldiers. And Bill Hartsaw actually came and led the discussion on that book because he knew the principles that were involved in that particular engagement. There's another 14 books that we've read just on broad world history kinds of things. The Rise and Fall of the Ottoman Empire, for example, is one that comes to mind. We read a Putin book, which we since, that was a while back, but we've since had some discussion about that considering current events today. It's all his history, where he was in the KGB in Eastern Germany after World War II, and how he, if you will, progressed within the Russian political system. And we read 5 books on World War II and the World Wars. 5 out of all the books I've covered here is like 144 books that we've read over this past, since at least I've been involved. So it's a broad spectrum of books. In addition to the Boys in the Boat, I just want to mention a handful of others that I'll kind of turn over to Bob a little bit. In addition to the Boys in the Boat and Zelda that I mentioned to you all that we read, which was a kind of a faith-oriented or historical faith-oriented book. One of the other ones that and this is only a subset, I've enjoyed, as I say, 70 or 80% of all the ones we've read. But one of the other ones was Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage to the South Pole by Alfred Lansing. It was it's a true story, so I would include it under, but I put it under adventures. So it's historical in context, but it's, any of you have heard of him. As a matter of fact, his story, it's in the military and some of the leadership training courses, and I'm not sure, it may also occur in some business environments. His story is used as a training mechanism for leadership, military leadership, but also in some cases business leadership. So I just kind of, that was interesting.
Well, and I know Bob Plumb has done some categorization of books as well. And
Yeah,
Well, to some extent I have.
why don't you go ahead, Bob?
One of the things that people, of course, whenever I say I'm a member of the men's book club of Tennent Presbyterian, oh, do you read spiritual and religious books? And I kind of think, well, yes, we do, but not exclusively. And I was surprised when I looked over the list. The Gift of the Jews by Thomas Cahill, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christian, Understanding Islam, an Introduction to the Muslim World. Rabbi Paul, an intellectual biography, The Next Christendom, The Coming of Global Christianity, Faith and Politics, how the Moral Values Debate Divides America, The Victory of Reason, How Christianity Led to Freedom, and on and on. So we do read a number of faith books, but we try to look at a number of different categories, and Bob mentioned one of them, is sports, and I must confess I'm not a big sports reader, but the books that we have read, which include Friday Night Lights and The Boys in the Boat, were just outstanding pieces of literature, in addition to being sports oriented. So they were great. And since the other two gentlemen have talked about their beginning, I started in 2005 after I retired in April. And the book that the men's book group was reading then was Franklin and Winston, about the relationship of Franklin and Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. I was mesmerized. Luis can tell you, I went out on the porch with that book, and I think I just read it until, the sun went down. But it was excellent. And I must also confess, there's been some books I started, and either because of a time crunch or I got in it and I thought, I'm not really crazy about this. And then I go to the book club meeting and I hear the conversation. I think, I'm going back to reading that book. And another fact that seems to pop up periodically is what a wonderful book that was, and I never would have picked it up, just browsing through the bookstore, thinking about things or hearing something. But it just was so intriguing, and I'm so glad I had a nudge to category.
Well, Bob, you were talking about, used to read books until the sun went down. Well, where I'm from, we used to read the books until the cows came home. But very much the same idea, though, that you read a book and you have no idea that you're going to like it, much less not be able to put it down. And it's because of the diversity of the group. I mean, we've got on all political scales, sides of the aisle, represented in the book club. And some of the books that we have read, I would never have picked up if it hadn't been mandated by the majority of our group that this is going to be the book that we read next month. And it turns out that almost every time, without exception, they've been wonderful books, and I really enjoyed them, and especially enjoyed the discussion, like you were saying.
I would also say that we don't have too many qualifications on what can be proposed, although we don't meet in July at all. And that's the time we save for the big books. So if anybody proposes a book that's over 300, 400 pages, then we save that one until July, August, so we can come back to September.
And just one other point on that, just to follow up on that for just a second, is you don't have to be an expert reader. So the thing that goes around the group is usually the litmus test on how many pages in a book we read monthly. If it's like 250, that's probably okay for Ed and I. Because we're both sort of with a technical background, and those of us that read where we move our lips while we're reading, we can't get through 300, 400 pages in a month. So, you don't have to be an expert reader or, for that matter, an expert literary person. So I don't consider myself in that way. And to Bob's point, there's a number of books that I never would have read that I thoroughly enjoyed because of the way the group has, we've got a whole spectrum of diversity in the group. So,
and I would also say that, unlike a college class, there's no esoteric discussions here. We don't go into really deep character studies or anything. We talk about the book and why it appealed to us and how it appealed to us, and some of the things that struck us about the book.
Well, and the backgrounds of our book group, we've got people that grew up in New York State. We have others that grew up, born and raised in Texas. I'm from South Carolina. We've got local people. So people bring their personal perspectives and their background and things, the culture that they grew up with, bring that to the group and share that. So again, making I think the selections that we have made particularly valuable.
I must also say there have been a couple of books we've read, which we traditionally, after we're done discussing, usually we start at 10:30, usually around 11:30, quarter to 12, we make plans to go to Hunter's Inn to either continue the discussion or have lunch. And I would walk in at 10:30 thinking, how are we going to use an hour and a half? And it's magic. It fills up the time and with worthwhile conversation. So even books that I thought, well, I'm not sure it has enough going for it to sustain an hour and a half of conversation, always surprises me.
Well, and going to Hunter's Inn is always the fun. It's not only do we read intellectually stimulating books, but there's a social aspect to the book club as well, as we get to know each other and then, like Bob said, we continue every month we go to Hunter's Inn and sometimes continue the discussion, and other times we try to solve the world's problems.
we're not too successful. Yeah, about the rock. Yeah.
I'm just curious, I see some old classics in your reading list, like 1984 or Grapes of Wrath. And then, of course, you have new current bestseller kind of books. So I'm just curious, when do you decide to reach back, 50 years ago to a classic? How do you make that decision?
Two things we try to do. First of all, if you look over the list, you'll find that 75–80% of the books are nonfiction, and we do like history. And it doesn't matter whether we've read Egyptian history, Greek and Egyptians, or modern history. But in addition to that, there, as Bob mentioned, we do like to have a sports book. Once a year, we try to read a sports book. And once a year, we try to read a classic. And you mentioned several of them, Rob. But I also, you'll notice that Jane Eyre is in there, for instance. And, you know, you wouldn't expect a men's book group to be reading Jane Eyre, but, you know, there we did and enjoyed it and had a good discussion. So yes, we do like to read a classic and we Kidnapped, we read and.
Well, that and one of the ones I suggested when we were looking for a classic book was Treasure Island.
Treasure
I could almost see the eyes rolling. You know, oh, what are you talking about? So fortunately, we all came back whenever that book was read and everybody loved it. We saw it with new eyes.
Exactly.
As older men, we probably all read it as kids, but there was a whole different aspect to Treasure Island when we go back and we read it.
And so-
it's brilliantly written. So
And Robinson Crusoe, so we definitely try to read at least one classic a year.
Yeah.
And very few New York Times current bestseller lists. We'll occasionally read a bestseller, but we have no problem going back 3 or 4 years or 30, 40 years back. So
I was following up on that point. You said intentionally you have a history book, a sports book, a classic, no politics, and then rarely bestsellers or popular. That was so 2 questions. Do you try to get through sort of an intentional theme each, like 1 month is history, 1 month sports, 1 month classic? That's one question. And then second, is there a recurring author, someone you've read and you say, oh, we've got to read another one by this author? Or is that taboo?
Emily, first of all, to answer your first question, that's far too organized for our.
Well, to answer your question, we read The Gentleman in Moscow by Emma Toles. And then Neil Curry said, well, his first book was something called Rules of Civility. Thank you. And we like that, maybe not as much as The Gentleman in Moscow. Then when his new book, The Lincoln Highway, came out, we have to read that. So I think that there is a little bit when we have a
We
favorite
see
author.
paper stuff, but again, it's to Ed's point, it's not all that organized. It's sort of like we all kind of contribute and it just turns out this way. It's just amazing how the group as a total without a crib sheet of, okay, here are the rules and this is what we have to do this month, next month. It just kind of works out to be quite diverse as you can kind of see from this listing. The other thing I want to mention about Gentleman of Moscow, just to go back to another theme I think that Bob had mentioned about, when we chose this book, I had no idea who the author was. I had no idea about the book. But I read a little caption about the book and it said, okay, it's about a guy in Moscow during the time of the communist revolution period in history who stays in a hotel and has all of these experiences. I said, there's not going to be, I kind of like a little bit more excitement, you know. It's going to be a very boring book, but I'll give it a shot. Because that author, and some of you have, I think some of you have actually read that book. I'm looking around. You have, Karen, and so on. But that author, I have not seen another author, there may be one, but I've not seen another author that is able to take you into the personality of the characters and the situation as though you're there, and he was just phenomenal and I was glued to the book. So, I mean, that's an interesting, one other one I wanted to also mention, because again, it was one we weren't too sure about when we selected it, but it's called, it's on the last page on page 6, in 2021, last year, called Amazing Grace, William Wilberforce and the Campaign to End of Slavery by Max Metaxas. And that book, also with the, all the things running around, certainly this country in terms of, civil liberties and the history that we've had and so on, the racial aspects. That book was interesting because first of all, I think it took place back in the 1800s or somewhere, even before our Civil War, if you will. And where Wilberforce, he was in the UK. And it turns out, I had no idea, but this guy, before anti-slavery became a point with our Civil War, even before that with the abolitionist movement, this fellow in the UK, where they were, had slavery issues around the world, he was a leader and a very small, and he was a UK parliamentarian and so on but he was a leader and interfaced with a lot of people around the world, including in this country, some of our presidents, Lincoln and others before him. And it was just a fascinating historical rundown of his work. In fact, I learned as a result of that book, I think, let's see, where is this? I think it may be in Ohio. There's a college, Wilberforce College. It's an all-black college. It was named after this fellow. So he had a profound impact in this country. This is the early 1800s, the late 1700s, early 1800s, where he had his impact. So anyway, interesting. Again, another example of the diversity of what we try to cover. Yeah, Rob.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Del.
Yeah, a question for the panel. You've talked about the books that you like the most. You've talked about those that have an impact on you. I'd like the three of you, each one, to tell us what is the worst book that you read in the book club? What is tops your list of the worst books? I wouldn't think you keep a list of them, but at least I'd like to hear what you can critically say.
Okay, Bob Plumb's got one.
I do not have one. I do not recall any book in the entire time I've been with the men's book club that I didn't enjoy. Some less than others, but I enjoyed them all. I can't say there was a book that I wish I'd never cracked the spine on. I honestly have to say that.
Okay, now I want to also add to that, which I agree with. And Bob used the word that we have read in this list. Okay. But I don't know, during the past 4 or 5 months, I think, there was a book that we chose for the month. Somebody started reading it early on, and they said, this is not for us. We thought it was. And Ed came out and said, let's drop that one and go to this one, because we still had 3 weeks left in the month or whatever before we were going to meet. And I don't even remember what the title of that book was, but remember that book?
Yeah, I do remember.
So
Ed, tell us, what is the title of the book?
I don't know.
There are,
I don't remember.
well,
Yeah.
I ask for, and people send to me books that they have read,
Yeah.
that they've heard about, that they've read reviews or whatever. They've got a suggestion that we might want to consider this particular book for our next book group. So I keep a running list of those suggestions,
Yeah.
and I bring those to the group every month, and that's where we select our next read. The one that comes to mind that was very a tough read that we ended up dropping was about St. Augustine, and I don't remember the name of the book.
Yes. Yeah.
But if you're interested in reading that, Dale, and reporting to us, I'll get that.
Yeah, it's pretty funny, Ed, but if you have a book club, you have to be critical as well. And just to hear that everything is fine and all the books are good probably isn't accurate.
You're welcome to go to that kind of book club if you want, Dale, but our book group, we are not critical in that way, that we are instead.
That's what I was probing.
We're focused on books that we think that we would all enjoy reading, regardless of our backgrounds and perspectives. So you go back to Emily's question. Are there authors? One author that comes to mind is Eric Larson. We've read several of Eric Larson's books. Almost always enjoy his. We're reading right now a Bill Bryson book, and he has written a number of books that we have enjoyed and continue to go back and read. But I also like Bob Stow mentioned, I joined the book club in 2009, and the one I remember with the very first book that I read was on September 15th. It was The Coldest Winter by David Halverston, and just a wonderful book. And I had worked for IBM for almost 40 years, and I've read a lot of technical manuals during that time, and it had been 10 or 15 years since I had read a book a real true book other than a manual. And so retiring gave me the chance to sit down, and I was introduced. John Klaus dragged me in there, and I've read the first book, which in my case was The Coldest Winter. I think we all remember the first book that we read as part of the book club, and it just made an impression, and we've been hooked ever since. So,
And I think to go back to Dell's question, we don't select books. I mean, it's a group decision. We don't select books that are generally from, sort of obscure places. We pick ones that are from authors that are good writers. And I think to underscore what Ed said, we got into this book, and was it St. Augustine?
Yeah.
It was just dense and not well written, and we just put it aside. So it's not that we disagree with the content as much as it is, if it's not something you can pick up and read relatively easily, then this is not a scholarly book club. So I would make that clear. And on the diversity side, one of the books that I was intrigued by that we read recently is The Berlin Diary by William Shiver. It was written in late 1930s, and he catalogs the rise of Hitler, how incremental it was, and how people were affected by it. To me, it was an absolutely brilliant book and very, very serious. The one we're reading now, A Walk in the Woods, if any of you have read it, Louise can tell you, I've been laughing out loud.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
There's a real difference in the books that we choose.
I still have a question, how you select your books. And it sounds like some people have already read the book, maybe when they send you their recommendation, Ed, or do you find that there are certain book lists that people draw from? Do you depend on Amazon reviews? Or I'm just curious, because obviously you can't read every good book. You have to figure out a way to winnow it
Karen's
down.
obviously been writing books for many years.
I want to know.
and not only do we not read every book, sometimes Bob Stow and I have trouble reading a book a month. But
Well, let me just for a second here. Karen suggested two books to us: The Boys in the Boat and The River of Doubt, about Theodore Roosevelt's journey down the Amazon. They were wonderful. We thank you very much.
and we get recommendations from women. There's a 48-year-old lady down in North Carolina who recommended A Walk in the Woods. And if Bob has mentioned how funny it was, that would be my daughter. She said, "You can read this thing." So we suggested that and are reading it now, and I think everyone's enjoying that. But where they come from, I don't really have any idea. People, sometimes they've read them. And say, I've just finished the book, and it says we've got some very prolific readers and they'll read multiple books a month, and they will come back. I've read this one and would recommend and suggest that. Other people may read reviews that someone else recommends a book that they think this one looks really interesting, the topics of interest. And so anyway, where they come from, I don't know. People send me so I've got a running list, and I just keep that and share it with the rest of the group.
I would say New York Times, Wall Street Journal are big areas that we sort of trust as
Sources.
And just to show that running list, just to emphasize that is very important. It's not like we all show up, okay, we just had our meeting, what are we gonna do the next time, which is what we do, Ed usually leads that. But the point is that we have this running list that's there and has a lot of books on it, and we sometimes talk about that. People contribute others to it. We then review that list. We sort of informally, as Ed says, make a selection out of that. We may say, here's a couple, and generally somebody in the group has some knowledge about the particular books that are on that list, and so we'll add, and on that list too, Ed keeps who recommended the book, so that person can kind of talk to it a little bit, at least the reason they recommended it. We can all listen to that and then kind of make a judgment. People say 3 or 4, and then we neck those down.
Louise, you had a question.
My question is, who leads the discussion? Is it the person who suggested the book, or just kind of open forum?
Open forum. Then again, you give us too much credit for being organized. Whoever raises their hand or speaks up, I mean, seriously, there is no leadership in the group. So
Often when I read, I see it through a theological lens, or it informs my faith in some way, no matter what I'm reading. There are those connections that are to be made, often with literature. I wonder if you all, I mean, you mentioned the overtly sort of religious books that you read, but I wonder if you all make those connections just naturally in your group with faith as the conversation emerges fluidly, or not.
We read an awful lot of history, and I'm talking about history throughout the ages, and you cannot study history without including religion in it.
Yeah.
The book we just finished is called The Bright Ages, as opposed to the Dark Ages. The Bright Ages, a new history of medieval Europe, and that one, you know, is not overtly religious, but there's an awful lot of religion and the influence of the Pope and the Catholic Church and the Eastern Church and the Western Church and so forth. So, you know, even without being overtly religious, there's an awful lot of religion in many of these books.
And do you name that? Like, talk about, well, this, I thought about this in terms of where I am on my journey. Apply it personally to your faith walk. Sort of curious.
Sometimes, but I would say, I would put it in a slightly different way. And maybe it does encompass faith, but I look at it even as a little more broader. We all come from life perspectives based upon, we all lived a long time. We're older guys. And so what happens is we each have a slightly different perspective on life and what it all means, okay? And often when we get into these discussions of the book, we'll say, well, that didn't make sense, or, oh, that's a very interesting occurrence that occurred. And we all approach it from a slightly different point of view as to how we would interpret that from our life experience today, if that were to happen, or an observation on history, as Ed had mentioned before. So I wouldn't say that we're every time, you know, leading into a faith discussion.
No.
It's somewhat more of a contemporary discussion relative to the books and the content that we're reading. But depending upon the book, it does lead us in that direction. I mean, the Zelda book was one example that we went in that direction a little bit. One other book, in addition to what Ed had mentioned, was on, again, the last page in 2019, we read God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible by Adam Nicholson. And that was kind of interesting because it's how the King James Bible came about at that period in history. And so it was kind of, again, it was historical in context, but at least I think we all learned a bit as to what inspired that to occur based upon history and you know, in that whole situation. James, did you have a question?
Yeah, what was the book you recommended for leaders? You said people use it to train
Shackleton.
leaders.
Shackleton.
Yeah.
Shackleton.
Leadership of him personally, basically, and his story on leadership. It's used in leadership training courses, particularly in the military, I'm aware.
Well, Shackleton is the principle. The name of the book is Endeavor, I believe.
Yeah.
Endeavor. Okay.
Endeavor.
So, yeah, so this is, now, you might think that after this exhaustive list, for the past, what, 20 years, I guess, you might think there are no more books to be read. And we would encourage folks, or any of you that feel so inclined, or to kind of join our group, because it's informal, it's educational in an informal way, because we're all learning a lot from these books. And plus it's social, because, you know, we go to one chapter and it's a wonderful time together, and it's
well, I mentioned that there'd be a quiz at the end of the session here, and the quiz, and I'll give you a running start here. I'd like to know from each of you what a favorite book is that you've read, and it doesn't matter if you've just read it or if it was 50 years ago when you were in kindergarten or middle school or whatever. So anyway, we're sincerely interested in your input. So be thinking about that, and I'll come around and call on you, right?
So, it probably is on your list, but, Undaunted Courage, have you read that?
Yeah.
I think we did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
Stephen,
Lewis,
Stephen Ambrose.
Stephen Ambrose.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we did.
the core of discovery, right?
The story of the Lewis and Clark
Lewis and Clark, yeah.
expedition
Oh,
to,
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
the source of the Missouri River.
I've read
Okay.
it personally, but I don't know if we read it as a book group.
It's a
Nope,
good book.
I will
Yeah.
so
I
note.
think it would be up your alley if you hadn't read it.
Yep, and the name again?
Undaunted Courage.
Undaunted
That's right,
Courage,
yeah.
Stephen Ambrose.
Thank you. All right, any other questions? If not, I'm willing to take names and suggestions now.
One suggestion here before we start. We've often been posed the question, well, what if women want to join the group? And we would say, if there's a particular book or books that you're interested in, join us.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no commitment that once you come for one book that you have to come for every single meeting. But if you see a book that's, wow, that really sounds interesting.
If you don't mind being tagged with the knowledge that you've actually come to a men's book group, we would welcome you.
That's,
As I recall, early on, a woman tried to, when this was first being organized, and it was made really clear that this was a men's organization, because there was nothing for men in the church. I mean, it was
Yeah.
nothing, and I think it's, and they also, I do recall early on saying that it was not per se a religious book group.
Right.
That was not the goal of it, but it happened.
Well, the scary thing about the book club, the very, very, very first time that I attended, John Klaus was the head of the book group, and he announced that he was retiring, and he had done it for 10 years or whatever, 15 years, and he asked me if I would do it the very first time. So don't be scared off that if you show up for the first time, you automatically become head of the book group. So it doesn't always happen that way. So anyway, anybody got any suggestions on books?
One of my favorites is called Time and Again, by, I think it's Jack Finney.
Thank you.
Here's an old one, The Bridge of San Luis Rey, Thornton Wilder, an oldie but a goodie.
Many of these books, not many of these books, but a number of these books, we've all read before,
Yeah.
but they're so long ago. In my case, my memory is so bad that if I had read it last week, I could pick it up as a new read. So, but yeah, that one certainly rings a bell.
My favorite, and it just is beautiful, it might be a summer read, Anna Karenina. Just gorgeously written and heartbreaking.
All right, thank you.
Anything by Wallace Stegner.
I don't know, Wallace.
Crossing to Safety or Angle of Repose.
Stegler, can you spell that?
Stegner, Stegner, Wallace Stegner. Crossing to Safety or Angle of Repose are two that come to mind.
Crossing the state?
Safety. Crossing to Safety.
Cross to safety.
he taught at Stanford.
Is that right?
Huh.
Yeah, wonderful writer.
He was clearly not a member of the technical bulletin that I had. Dale Smith, what have you read that you'd recommend we read?
Two books, one entitled The Brick Moon, and that goes back to the 1700s. And secondly, Agatha Christie, Death on the Nile.
Brick Moon, B-R-I-C-K?
The Brick Moon. It's about the first attempt to land a rocket on the moon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right.
Don't forget Agatha Christie.
I've read or watched, I think almost every Agatha Christie. That was one of the first ones that my mother was able to get me interested in reading. So thank you for that suggestion.
What God looks for in a vessel
What God looks for a vessel. Who's it by, Daniel?
by, I don't know the
Books God looks for, what God looks for
in a vessel.
In a vessel.
in a vessel. Thank you.
I'll spell out the name of the writer, G-B-I,
E-B-I.
G-B-I,
GBI.
L-E,
Oh,
pronounced as Billy.
oh, right.
Forget the G is silent.
Uh-huh.
And the surname is A-K-N-N-I. Oh,
AKA-N-N-I.
A-K-A, yes, N-N-I.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Your countryman, I think.
Okay.
We recognize it's like a Nigerian name, so yeah.
Yeah.
All right, any others?
Oh, well,
Or comments?
I want to make a comment before we close. So if others are making book suggestions,
We're about to close. Yes, you're right.
I have one more.
Yes.
suggestion. I'm sure people have read it, but A Brave New World.
Brave New World,
Yeah, gives you what to think about.
Yeah. In fact, we came down to either reading A Brave New World or 1984.
Oh, I saw
And,
that.
because many of us had read those roughly the same time. And last year we read 1984, and we have not read A Brave New World in a while, so thank you.
By the way, Ed, this is Dell. The Brick Moon was written by Edward Everett Hale in 1869.
Wow.
Speaker at the. Gettysburg
Edward
Address.
Everett Hale.
Thank you. All right, got it.
So now you have a new running list.
Yes, we do. These will be added onto our current list, so.
so I just wanted to say, this book club has contributed to the cultural life at PPC in many interesting ways. So we have probably done 26 years of Dine with Nines times for minus 28 years minus 2 for COVID, but we've probably done 100 Dine with Nines. And the most memorable Dine with Nine ever was one that was hosted by the Plumbs. Dell and Mary Margaret were there, Karen and I were there, and it featured a dramatic reading by Bob Plumb of about 3 paragraphs of how to behave at a dinner party. And,
Or how not to be there.
or how not to behave at a dinner party. And there were a couple words I never heard, decolletage, is a word I'd never heard before. I didn't know what that word meant. That was featured in the 3 paragraphs, but it has, the book club has contributed in many ways to the PPC family.
Well, that's good to know. Rules of civility right there.
We want to thank you all very much for inviting others to join your group and for sharing your book list with us and your wisdom and the humor that you bring to it. I hear from what you've said, it's an open invitation. So look out, because some of us might be joining you. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you, everybody.
All right, let me, wait, I'm just gonna stop our recording.
Use these on the table.
Yes.